If you drove past it without knowing what you were looking at, you might think it was some kind of embassy or a government palace or maybe a museum that had always been there, anchored in stone since the beginning of time. But the Elms is none of those things. It's something stranger, because this grand house, this perfect Gilded Age mansion standing on a manicured lawn in Newport, Rhode Island, is basically a glitch in the American story, a leftover, a survivor, and it was never supposed to survive. For a brief moment in the 20th century, the plan was simple. Strip it, gut it, knock it down, and erase it. Turn it into something profitable, something modern, something forgettable. A parking lot, a block of anonymous apartments, just another square on the Monopoly board. Instead, it's still here. Walk up the gravel drive and you immediately feel that weird tension. The house is gorgeous, almost mathematically symmetrical, but there's this quiet weight to it, like it's aware you don't quite belong here. You might feel the urge to lower your voice without even knowing why. It's not a home, it's a statement. It's a fortress built out of money. And not just any money. Coal money. The kind of money that comes from darkness, from tunnels, from men and boys underground breathing dust so thick it coats the back of your throat. Money from a fuel that powered American dreams and American nightmares at the same time. That's the part this place doesn't advertise. Out front, the Elms is all limestone, balustrades, terraces, sculpted hedges, and serene marble statues that never break a sweat. But beneath it, behind it, hidden inside it, is the story of the people whose lives were spent making this fantasy possible. Miners, servants, cooks, maids, drivers, and the effort later on to pretend that none of it ever happened. That is the dark story of the Elms. Not just how it was built, but how America tried to bury it. So let's do this properly. Imagine you're arriving in Newport, not today, but around 1905. The road isn't lined with cars yet. You hear the clatter of carriages and the occasional cough of a brand new automobile struggling up the hill. The air smells like the ocean, but also like coal smoke drifting from chimneys and ships out in the harbor. This isn't just a resort town. This is the summer capital of a very specific empire, the Gilded Age rich. They call these mansions cottages, which is probably the most disrespectful thing you can call a building of this size. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, all clustered along Bellevue Avenue like a row of crowns on a velvet cushion. Each one belongs to a family whose last name might as well be a logo. Vanderbilt, Astor, Morgan. You don't just live here, you announce yourself here. And then there's the Elms. It doesn't scream the way some of its neighbors do. It doesn't have the same over-the-top look-at-me decorations on the outside. It looks controlled, French, elegant, like someone took an 18th century chateau from the outskirts of Paris and quietly dropped it on the New England coast. That wasn't an accident. The man behind this house knew exactly what he wanted to say. His name was Edward Julius Berwind. He didn't come from the old aristocratic families of New England, no Mayflower, no centuries-old pedigree. His story was the new American formula. Immigrant parents, hustle, the right connections, and a willingness to go into businesses where you did not ask too many questions about what happened out of sight. In his case, that business was coal. Not the kind of coal you used in your little fireplace at home, but the industrial fuel that ran factories, railroads, steamships, and steel mills. If you could control coal, you could control entire economies. And Berwind was very good at controlling coal. Picture the world he operated in. Deep in Pennsylvania and other coal regions, boys barely tall enough to reach a man's shoulder wash coal in freezing water, picking out bits of slate with numb fingers. Men go underground before dawn, lamps on their helmets, their lives basically tied to the strength of a wooden beam and the luck of the rock above them. Explosions, cave-ins, black lung, company towns where the coal operator owns the houses, the store, sometimes even the church. You live, work, and die in the shadow of your employer. Now imagine that somewhere up the chain from that reality, in a boardroom lined with polished wood and engraved glass, there's a man looking at ledgers and contracts, talking about production, output, and profit per ton. That man is Edward Berwind. That disconnect between how the money is made and how the money is spent is exactly what you feel when you stand in front of the Elms. For Berwind, Newport is not just a vacation spot, it's a stage. And he doesn't want to be just another rich guy renting someone else's mansion. He wants his own statement. So he hires an architect known for luxury and American versions of European grandeur. He buys the land. He has the old house on the property taken down. And then, like a conjuring trick, the Elms starts to rise, stone by stone, steel beam by steel beam. From the front, you see this graceful, symmetrical facade. But what you don't see, what you can't see, unless someone shows you, is how modern this house actually is for its time. Behind those classical columns is a kernel-level obsession with technology, efficiency, and control. The Elms is wired from the start. It has its own electrical systems, its own mechanical heart beating below the main floors. It's a house designed not just to impress, but to run like a machine. Think of it as a 3-layer cake. The top layer is what the guests see, the reception hall, the ballroom, the dining room, the drawing rooms, the terraces. This is the visible theater of wealth. High ceilings with frescoes, marble fireplaces, silk-covered walls, chandeliers dripping with crystal, lit by the magic of electricity, no smoky gas flames, no candles sputtering out at midnight. Everything bright, steady, effortless. The middle layer is where the family actually lives, the bedrooms, the private sitting rooms, the bathrooms with their new plumbing, the dressing rooms. Still luxurious, but slightly softer, less public. This is where clothes are changed, letters are written, confidential conversations are held. And then there's the bottom layer, the basement. Down there it's a different world entirely. Massive boilers roar, coal is shoveled, pipes rattle. There might be a small power plant, laundry rooms so big they feel like factories, giant mangle irons for sheets and tablecloths, storage rooms for food and wine, refrigerated spaces for meat and ice, and a maze of corridors connecting everything. It's hot, loud, and bright in a harsh, bare bulb way. No silk, no marble, no gold leaf. Just brick, steel, and muscle. That's the part of the Elms that most of its original guests never saw. But for the staff, it was the center of the universe. Before we go upstairs into the glitter, let's stay down here for a minute, because this is where the real day begins. It's early, very early. The sky outside is still dark. Most of Newport is asleep. But under the Elms, it's already awake. The kitchen lights come on. Water starts to bubble in huge pots. Coffee is brewing, sometimes chicory to stretch it. The cook is already barking orders. Scullery maids begin washing whatever pots were left from the night before. Bread is baking, filling the corridors with that warm, yeasty smell that makes you hungry even if you swore you'd never eat again after last night's 10-course dinner. Footsteps echo on stone floors. A butler checks the silver. A footman irons the newspaper so that the ink doesn't rub off onto the master's fingers. Someone is polishing shoes in a tiny windowless room off one of the corridors, leaning over hundreds of dollars worth of leather, their own boots worn and cracked. Servants' bells hang like a nervous system on the wall, one for each room, each labeled. If a guest in the south guest room needs something, a bell rings, and a specific servant is expected to appear quietly within moments, as if they were just always nearby, waiting. They aren't supposed to be seen until they're needed. In a place like the Elms, invisibility is part of the job description. Now, up above, on the main floor, the mansion is still. It smells faintly of last night's cigar smoke and perfume. The curtains are heavy. You can almost feel the echoes of last night's laughter hanging in the air, but they're fading. Soon, maids will move through those rooms like ghosts. They'll open windows, dust, sweep, clean the ashes from grates, reorder books on tables, fluff cushions, straighten rugs, polish any smudged surfaces, and all of it has to be finished before the family comes down. By the time the first guest wanders out, yawning, everything has to look like it woke up flawless. No one is supposed to see the work. This division, front of house perfection, back of house grind, is baked into the design. The Elms has separate staircases for the staff, narrow, steep ones that twist up behind the walls, never touching the glamorous, wide, sweeping staircase in the center of the main hall. Servants' corridors run parallel to the guest spaces, connecting rooms from behind, so that a maid can appear, adjust a curtain, refill a glass, and vanish again. For the people who own the house, it's a kind of magic. For the people who run it, it's a job that never ends. Now, let's meet the man who insisted this machine run exactly his way. Edward Berwind is not one of those flamboyant rich guys who wants to be photographed everywhere. He's more controlled, more reserved, more corporate in a way. There's a military precision to him. He was in the Navy in his youth, and that sense of hierarchy and order doesn't leave easily. In the coal business, he's known for being tough, not the kind of employer who bends to unions or sentimental appeals. He believes in efficiency, in discipline, in the idea that if everyone just does their job, the machine keeps running and the profits keep flowing, and that this is, somehow, the natural order of things. In Newport, that mindset translates into house rules, schedules, expectations, standards. The grass should be a certain height, the hedges trimmed just so, the silver spotless, the table laid with a brutal attention to detail, which fork goes where, how far apart each plate should be, where the crystal glasses catch the light from the candles and electric bulbs. If a guest shows up at the Elms, they are entering a carefully designed experience. They're seeing a man who has turned raw rock from underground into social status, into a seat at the table of America's elite. Every piece of marble and every painted ceiling is a data point, a little line item on a much larger report, proof of success. But there's a catch. No matter how perfect the Elms is, people like Berwind are still new money compared to some of the families around them. Old wealth looks at coal money with a particular kind of snobbery, even as they rely on that coal to heat their country houses and drive their trains. So the Elms is also a kind of argument, a rebuttal that says, look, I may not have ancestors who fought in colonial wars, but I can build a house every bit as beautiful as any European aristocrat's estate. I can hire the same sculptors. I can buy art that your great-grandparents couldn't have dreamed of. You can imagine some of the guests gliding up those front steps. Ladies in silk gowns and impossible corsets. Men in perfectly tailored evening coats, hair slicked back, calling each other by last names and titles from various clubs. They arrive in carriages or early motor car, stepping onto polished stone, greeted by a butler, their coats whisked away, their names announced in a hall designed entirely around the idea of being impressive. On the surface, it's just another party. Underneath, it's a summit of power. Railroad men, bankers, politicians, industrialists, all swirling through the rooms like planets orbiting each other. Pause that scene for a second and zoom outward. While this dinner is happening at the Elms, somewhere hundreds of miles away, a mine is running through the night. Men underground by the light of lamps, air so dusty it looks like fog, coal loaded into carts, rolled out, dumped, sorted, shipped, a few hundred tons from one mine, part of millions of tons moving like a black river across the country. If you followed that coal along the tracks, through rail yards, into industrial plants and ship bunkers, and then followed the money it generated, eventually, that line would draw you back to places like this house. So when you look up at the ceiling in that dining room and see a painting of mythological figures floating in clouds, you can think of it as beautiful, or you can think of it as a very expensive distraction from what's happening at the other end of the economic chain. And for a long time, that distraction works. In Newport, the Gilded Age is in full swing. Newspapers report on the parties, the costume balls, the yacht races, the extravagant displays of wealth. Someone throws a party where the favors are jewels. Someone else builds a ballroom too big to heat properly, but that's not really the point. The point is to be seen, to establish a reputation. Guests might gossip about who's in and who's out, whose fortune is stable and whose is risky. They might speculate about which heirs will marry into which families, merging fortunes like corporations do. The Elms fits into this world perfectly. Downstairs, in the servants' quarters, it's another story. Sometimes, you had entire families in service across different houses. A sister might be a maid at one cottage while her brother is a footman at another. Wages are low, hours are long, but the status of working in a good house means something. If you work at the Elms, you're expected to meet a high bar. The servants' dormitories are tucked up under the roof, far from the glamorous guest bedrooms. Narrow beds, simple furniture, a window if you're lucky, shared bathrooms. You come off a shift at midnight, knowing you have to be back up well before dawn. You learn the rhythm of the house, like other people learn music, when breakfast is served, when the family prefers their tea, how many lumps of sugar one guest takes, and how another hates lemon. Where to step so the floors don't creak. Which staircase lets you get from the pantry to the dining room fastest. If you do your job perfectly, no one notices you. If you slip, they do. But for all the hierarchy and all the inequality, there's also a strange intimacy in a place like this. Servants overhear conversations that guests assume are private. They read moods in the way a glass is set down or a door is closed. They see the masters of the universe drunk, embarrassed, arguing, ill, vulnerable. And sometimes, the power flows both ways in small, quiet ways. Someone turns a blind eye, someone helps themselves to a little extra food, someone protects another servant from a harsh reprimand. Human beings are still human beings, even inside this machine. Now, above the servants, above the guests, the Elms also houses something else: aspiration. Edward Berwyn doesn't have children to inherit this monument he's building, but he has a vision of what his name means. His wife, Sarah, hosts and manages the social side of that vision. Together, they're crafting a brand. The Elms is part of that brand. It says, "This is permanent. This is legacy." But history has a way of making a joke out of our ideas of permanence. Because while those glittering summers roll on, the world outside Newport begins to shift. The early 1900s are not just about parties and yachts. They're also about labor unrest, strikes, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, this level of inequality isn't sustainable. Investigative journalists are writing about tenements in the city, filthy meatpacking plants, child labor in factories and mines. These writers are sometimes called muckrakers, and they're dragging into the light exactly the kinds of conditions that supply the raw materials for houses like the Elms. Photographs begin to circulate: children with blank, tired eyes standing next to coal chutes, men with soot-blackened faces at the end of a shift. At the same time, in mansions like this one, portraits show their employers in immaculate clothing, posed in drawing rooms with polished floors and carefully arranged books. Two Americas, sharing the same timeline, barely acknowledging each other. But it can't stay that way forever. As the new century moves forward, the Gilded Age shades into something else. Antitrust laws start breaking up the biggest monopolies. Income taxes are introduced. There's a sense, however faint, that the party might not last forever. But rich families, being rich, often assume they'll find a way through. Then comes World War I. Ships need coal more than ever. Factories ramp up production. The industrial machine grinds even harder, and fortunes tied to heavy industry can spike. But the war also strains societies. People are asked to sacrifice, to accept rationing, to send their sons to the front. The optics of extreme luxury get trickier. Hosting a lavish ball while boys are dying overseas feels different than it did in peacetime. Some rich families tone things down. Others keep going because, well, this is how life has always been for them. For the coal operators, it's business as usual, plus war contracts. Through all this, the Elm stays in the Berwyn family orbit. It's used, loved, maintained, staffed. The lawns stay groomed, the hedges stay trimmed, the marble stays polished. The house absorbs all of this history quietly. Then, in the 1920s, another shift. After the trauma of the war and the influenza pandemic, people fling themselves into what we now call the Roaring Twenties. Jazz, shorter skirts, automobiles everywhere, a new kind of money from stocks and speculation. Old families try to keep up with new millionaires. Some do, some don't. The Elms is still there, but Newport itself begins to feel a little old-fashioned to some of the younger crowd. Palm Beach, the Hamptons, Europe for the summer, those start to rival or even replace Newport as the place to be. The center of gravity shifts just a bit. And then 1929. The stock market crashes, banks fail, businesses go under. People who thought their wealth was untouchable find out that numbers on paper can disappear almost overnight. The Great Depression hits, and suddenly, extreme opulence isn't just a little awkward. It's offensive. Families who own houses like the Elms face a brutal math problem. These mansions were never cheap to run. Taxes, maintenance, staff salaries, repairs, utilities, all add up to a cost that only makes sense if your income is steady and enormous. But what if it isn't anymore? You start seeing summer cottages shuttered, staff laid off, gardens left a little wild, mansions sold for a fraction of what they cost to build, or simply abandoned. It's a quiet kind of death for these houses. Not a dramatic fire or a siege, just bills that can't be paid. Coal operators, depending on how they're structured and diversified, experience the downturn in different ways. Some survive, some are ruined. Industries tied to basic fuel can weather some storms, but they're not immune to the collapse of other sectors. Through this turmoil, the Elms again clings on. By this time, Edward himself is an older man. Eventually, he dies and the house passes deeper into the family orbit, particularly into the hands of his sister Julia. Now, Julia Berwind is a fascinating figure in her own right. She is, in many ways, the last proud guardian of the old order at the Elms. Unmarried, independent, used to moving in high society, she carries on the rituals of life at the mansion long after most of her peers have retreated. While other families are closing up their Newport estates or selling them, she keeps the Elms going. The number of staff is reduced, of course. The utility of having a mansion for just a few people is questionable. But for Julia, this isn't just a house. It's part of her identity, part of her brother's legacy, part of a world she believes in. You can picture her in the mid-20th century, years after the Gilded Age has officially ended. Outside, the world has changed completely. Automobiles rule the roads, radios, then televisions, transform how people get news and entertainment. Wars have been fought that dwarf anything the Gilded Age elites could have imagined. World War II, the rise and fall of dictators, atomic bombs. In that context, Newport's mansions begin to look like relics, almost absurd. Yet inside the Elms, you can still have afternoon tea served on fine china. You can still walk through rooms that look like the early 1900s paused and then forgot to start again. Servants still use those back staircases. The bell system still hangs on the walls. Portraits of long-dead relatives still watch from their frames. It's like a time capsule that doesn't know it's a time capsule. There are stories of how Julia interacted with the modern world, keeping certain rituals, walking her dog, riding in an automobile but clinging to old habits. She is both of her time and profoundly out of it. And then, inevitably, time does what it always does. Julia dies. And with her, something else dies. The protection the Elms once had from the harsh light of modern economics. She could justify keeping it running as a personal choice. Her heirs don't have the same sentimental attachment. To them, the Elms is an asset, a property, a line on a list of things to be evaluated. And by the mid-20th century, the way America evaluates mansions like this has changed. We're in the post-war boom now. Suburbs are exploding across the landscape. Shopping centers and parking lots are sprouting where farms and estates used to be. The American dream is no longer a French-style chateau with dozens of servants. It's a single-family home with an attached garage, maybe a backyard grill. Old mansions stand in the way of that dream. They occupy valuable land in prime locations. They require specialized maintenance that fewer and fewer craftsmen know how to do. Their lavish decoration, once a point of pride, now reads to many eyes as vulgar. And perhaps most importantly, they are physical reminders of an era that a lot of people would rather file away under bad old days. So what do you do with a house like the Elms in this context? If you're a developer, the answer is easy. You see the land, not the house. You look at the square footage, at the location, and your mind starts drawing boxes. Apartments, condos, maybe a hotel. If you're really ruthless, maybe just asphalt and painted lines for cars. The house itself is a problem to be solved, and that's exactly what almost happens. The Elms is put on the market. At first, you can imagine the quiet hope. Maybe someone very rich will buy it and keep it intact. But taxes are high. Maintenance is a money pit. The list of people who can afford to casually adopt a massive Gilded Age mansion as a hobby is shrinking. So when a buyer appears with different plans, that offer starts to look very tempting. Documents are signed. The plan is this: strip the interior of anything valuable, sell the art, auction off the furniture, the rugs, the light fixtures, the silver. Anything that can be converted to cash is fair game. After that, the house itself will be demolished. The Elms, this meticulously designed, deeply symbolic house built with coal money to impress the world, will be reduced to rubble. The space will be cleared for something modern, profitable, unremarkable. And here's the crucial thing. No one at that moment thinks they're doing something particularly evil. They think they're being practical. This is just the natural cycle of real estate, right? Old things out, new things in. Progress. Make way for the future. But if you zoom out even a little bit, it's hard not to see the symbolism. The Gilded Age was a time of extremes: extreme wealth, extreme poverty, extreme confidence in progress, extreme blindness to the human cost of that progress. Houses like the Elms are monuments to that mindset. And here, in the mid-1900s, America is about to literally bulldoze one of those monuments, turning it into dust, and by extension, erasing a piece of evidence about who we used to be. If the Elms had gone down, 1,000 little stories with it would have disappeared. The footsteps worn into the servants' stairs, the fingerprints on the underside of banisters, the hand-lettered labels in the pantry. the mechanical systems in the basement that show how obsessed these people were with controlling every aspect of their environment. All of that was a week, a month, a year away from not existing anymore. But something was changing in the culture at exactly the same time. People were starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, you can't keep knocking down the past without losing something you'll regret later. Historic preservation movements were stirring. Folks in cities were fighting to save old theaters, train stations, row houses. In Newport, there were people looking around and saying, wait, are we really going to let these mansions all be destroyed? Do we want our kids and grandkids to only see them in black and white photographs? So when word got out that the Elms was on the chopping block, it didn't just quietly fade away. It sparked something. Picture the scene. The house is mostly empty now. A lot of the original furnishings have already been sold. Rooms that once glowed with light and music now echo. You can see the outlines on the walls where paintings used to hang, slightly cleaner patches amid decades of soft dust. Indentations in carpets show where furniture sat for years. Outside, the lawn is still neatly trimmed, but there's a nervous energy in the air. Locals know what's planned. There's talk, rumors, arguments in kitchens and on front porches, muttered conversations in town meetings, in church basements, in the back rooms of small shops. And then, a small group decides to do something about it. What they have is not money, at least not the kind of industrial money that built the Elms in the first place. What they have is conviction and maybe a little bit of desperation. They start calling people, writing letters, knocking on doors, explaining that, look, this isn't just a rich person's toy we're saving, it's a piece of history. They argue that houses like the Elms can be museums, classrooms, time machines. They can teach us things that textbooks and photographs can't. They can force us to confront how wealth used to look, and maybe how it still looks now in different forms. They set a deadline. If they can raise enough money fast enough, they can buy the Elms before the wrecking ball arrives. No guarantees. Can you imagine the stress of that countdown? Going to bed at night knowing that every day you don't find the funding, the house gets closer to being just a memory? Waking up and wondering if someone's already brought the demolition equipment in? But somehow, in that tense window of time, the tide turns. Donations come in, from wealthy sympathizers, from local businesses, from ordinary people who drop a few dollars into a fund because they feel, deep in their gut, that letting this house vanish would be wrong. Finally, the numbers line up. The offer is made, and at almost the last possible moment, the Elms changes hands, not to a developer, but to people who want to preserve it. On paper, it's a simple real estate transaction. In reality, it's a historical plot twist. The house that coal money built is now going to be funded by tickets, memberships, and donations from the general public. The Elms is saved, but that's not the end of the story. Saving a mansion and maintaining one are two very different battles. When the preservationists walk through the Elms for the first time as its new stewards, it's not all glamour. They see the cracks in the plaster, the fading paint, the leaking roof, the outdated wiring. They see rooms that have been stripped almost bare. They see a building that survived but not unscarred. The question becomes, do you restore it to some idealized version of its Gilded Age heyday? Do you try to freeze it at a particular year? Or do you embrace the layers of time, the patina, the signs of wear? And deeper than that, what story do you tell with this house? You could very easily just present the Elms as a beautiful artifact, a place where visitors come, walk through, admire the craftsmanship, take photos, and leave thinking, wow, the rich sure knew how to live. But if that's all you say, you're basically finishing the job the original owners started, using the house to distract attention from everything outside its walls. So, over time, the way the Elms is presented starts to expand. Yes, people come to see the marble, the chandeliers, the paintings, the formal gardens, but they're also invited, more and more, to go downstairs and upstairs into places the original guests never saw. The servants' corridors, the laundry rooms, the boiler rooms, the top-floor dormitories where maids slept 10 to a corridor under the eaves, hearing the wind rattle the roof while the family slept in carved wooden beds below. Suddenly, the Elms isn't just a stage for the wealthy. It's a 3D map of class, labor, and technology. If you walk through it with your eyes open, you can see how much of the Gilded Age depended on making certain people invisible. Think about something as simple as the dining room. When you stand in it now, you see the long table, The ornate chairs, the fireplaces, the painted ceiling, the massive sideboards that once held serving dishes. You can almost hear the clink of crystal, the low hum of conversation, maybe a bit of laughter that's just a little too loud after the third or fourth glass of wine. But if you trace the path of the food in your mind, you see something else. A dish being prepared in the basement kitchen, under heat and pressure, the cook keeping track of complex menus and timings, plates assembled in a flurry, wiped clean of any smudges, arranged perfectly. Then those plates are hustled up back stairs or a service elevator, through hidden corridors, into a small door at the side of the dining room. From there, they are carried by gloved hands into the golden light, presented as if they materialized out of nowhere. When the guests finish, the plates vanish just as silently, back through that side door, down the stairs, scraped, washed, stacked, dried, and prepared for the next course. That whole ecosystem is built into the house. Or take the call bell system. You might see it now on the wall, a series of little indicators, each labeled with a room name. In its day, a soft ring in the servants' hall meant someone upstairs wanted something. Staff would learn the specific tone, the specific label. The system was both a technological convenience and a reinforcement of hierarchy. One touch of a button upstairs, and someone downstairs has to stop what they're doing and respond. When you look at it closely, you're not just looking at an antique device, you're looking at a diagram of power. And then there's the basement, the literal underworld of the house. It's here that the connections back to coal become almost poetic. The Elms poured so much effort into eliminating coal dust and smoke from the experience of the family and guests. They wanted clean, convenient heat and light, not the dirty, labor-intensive reality of coal stoves in every room. So they centralized the mess. Large boilers, fed by coal that arrived already processed and ready. Ash bins to collect the waste. Ventilation systems designed to keep the fumes away from the main floors. The result? A house that feels effortless, run by a mechanical heart beating out of sight. And remember where that coal came from. Imagine a miner, deep underground, cutting and hauling coal that would eventually end up, in tiny part, in a bunker somewhere, then in a train, then into a delivery for a mansion like the Elms. He never sees the house. He never smells the gardens. He never stands in the reception hall. But his lungs, in a way, helped build this place. When you stand in that basement, you're standing at the intersection of two worlds, the industrial and the aristocratic, the dirty and the refined, the seen and the unseen. That's the power of preserving a place like this. It forces you to confront the connection between beauty and cost. And the story doesn't end with the Gilded Age and the mid-century rescue. Because once the Elms became a public site, it entered yet another phase of existence. Now the people walking through its halls aren't senators and socialites. They're tourists with cameras, students on field trips, locals who have driven past 100 times and finally decided to stop in. Some arrive already fascinated by history. Others come in expecting just another mansion tour and leave with their minds buzzing. They see, maybe for the first time, how much of early 20th century wealth depended on extracting resources and labor from elsewhere. They see the literal spaces where inequality lived, who slept where, who ate what, who could walk up which staircase. For some visitors, the Elms is strangely nostalgic, even if they never lived that life. It represents a lost world of craftsmanship, of attention to detail, of grand architectural visions. They mourn what we've lost in our era of prefabricated buildings and disposable interiors. For others, it's a cautionary tale. They walk through those rooms and think, we're still doing this. It just looks different now. The industries have changed, tech instead of coal, finance instead of railroads, but the basic pattern of wealth piling up at the top while others grind away to support it feels familiar. And there's another subtle layer here. Remember how America tried to bury the Elms? Yes, there was the literal attempt, the plan to demolish it and erase it from the landscape. But there was also a psychological, cultural attempt to bury the era it represented. After the Great Depression and the rise of a new middle class, there was a tendency to flatten the story of American progress, to tell it as, we started poor, we got rich, we had some problems, we fixed them, and now we're all sort of in it together. Houses like the Elms don't cooperate with that story. They sit there, stone and steel and marble, quietly contradicting the idea that we were ever all on the same level. They remind you that there were people who lived in this country who had entire rooms just for displaying one type of porcelain, while others lived in shacks without indoor plumbing. It's uncomfortable to look at that directly, so it's easier, in some ways, to knock it down and pretend it never existed. Preservationists, whether they say it out loud or not, are fighting against that kind of selective amnesia. They're saying, no, you don't get to edit this out just because it makes you uneasy. You don't get to only keep the parts of history that feel inspiring and tidy. The Elms is not relatable in the way we usually mean that word. Most of us will never sit at a 10-meter-long dining table under ornate plaster ceilings with servants refilling our glasses. We won't send a signal from a cozy salon and have someone appear with a tray as if they'd been waiting in a closet just off-screen. But the emotions inside the house and the structure of the society outside it, those are relatable. Ambition, fear, desire for security, need for status, anxiety about losing what you've built, shame sometimes about how you built it. You can imagine the private conversations Edward and Sarah Berwind might have had late at night. Did they ever talk about the miners, the strikes, the growing unrest in the country? Did they worry about political movements that threatened their fortunes? Or did they live in a carefully constructed bubble where such things were just something that happened back there, far away? You can imagine a maid staring out of a top-floor window at the ocean, wondering if this was all her life would ever be, making beds she would never sleep in, dusting books she'd never have time to read. You can imagine a footman standing perfectly still for hours during a party, watching men in tuxedos discuss deals and legislation that would affect thousands, maybe millions of people, without ever noticing the young man holding the tray next to them. In that sense, walking through the Elms today is less about nostalgia and more about recognition. We still have upstairs and downstairs, metaphorically. We still have people whose labor is invisible to the people enjoying the results. We still have beautiful things that are only possible because somewhere, someone is doing a job that's hard, dangerous, or brutally monotonous. The difference is that now, instead of a bell on the wall in a servant's hall, the command might come through an app, an email, a notification. Instead of a coal mine, the source might be a factory on the other side of the world, a supply chain we only see when it breaks. The Elms, as a physical object, gives us a way to think about all of that in one place. And there's a kind of irony in how we've reconfigured its purpose. Originally, the Elms was built to keep people out, to separate the elites from everyone else, to provide a controlled environment where the chaos of the industrial world could be kept at bay, to create a bubble of beauty funded by noise and dust somewhere else. Now, it's open to the public. You can buy a ticket and walk up that same front path, no invitation required, no social register, no relation to any coal executive, just the price of a tour and a willingness to climb a few flights of stairs. You can stand in the reception hall and look up at the same ceilings that once impressed senators, industrialists, and foreign dignitaries. You can lean on the same balustrades. You can, if you're allowed on the right tour, go down those back stairs and see where the laundry boiled away for hours. You might even feel a strange sense of ownership. Not in the legal sense, but in the cultural sense. This is part of my history too. My country built this. My society allowed this. And now I get to decide what I think about it. That's a very different kind of power than the original owners ever imagined they'd be giving away. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize the preservation either. When the Elms was saved, not everything came back. Some original pieces are gone forever, scattered to private collections, other museums, or simply lost. Some rooms had to be refurnished in ways that are approximate recreations rather than perfect restorations. The house you see now is both authentic and curated. It's as close as we can get, given the scrapes of time and the limits of our knowledge. In some cases, we rely on old photographs, auction catalogs, letters, and memories to piece together how a room looked, what hung on its walls, what sat on its tables. You're not just looking at the Gilded Age, you're also looking at decades of interpretation layered onto it. But in a way, that's honest. History is always like that. We're always reconstructing it from fragments, trying our best not to project too much of ourselves onto it, and inevitably failing a little bit. The trick is to stay aware of that. When you stand in the Elms ballroom, you're not actually seeing how it really was. You're seeing a careful attempt to evoke how it might have felt to someone standing there in 1910. The light, the sound of shoes on polished floors, the sense of volume in the room. Everything else is imagination filling the gaps. And you know what? That's okay. Because the point of a place like this isn't to provide a perfect time machine. It's to provide a stage for us to ask better questions. How did we get here? Who paid the price for this? What did people at the time see, and what did they refuse to see? What does it say about us that we almost destroyed this place? What does it say about us that we changed our minds? Think about that last question for a moment. The same culture that produced the Gilded Age excess of the Elms also produced, a few decades later, the instinct to erase it. We don't want to look at this anymore. It's embarrassing. It's impractical. It's in the way. That's a kind of self-protective reflex. But then another instinct emerged. Wait, we need to remember this, even if it makes us uncomfortable, especially if it does. The house almost died at the hands of progress, and then was resurrected by memory. Today, if you walk around the grounds, you might see kids running on the lawns that once hosted carefully orchestrated garden parties. You might see older visitors pausing on benches, letting their knees rest, talking quietly about their own grandparents and how different their worlds were. You might hear a guide explaining to a group that the marble in this room came from here, the wood from there, the artisans from over there. How everything in this house is a story of movement, of materials, of money, of people. You might hear, on certain tours, the guide talk about the coal fields, about the polluted air, the black water in mining towns, the company script that trapped workers in debt, not in a finger-pointing way, but in a this is the full picture kind of way. And you might watch people's faces soften, harden, shift as they connect the dots. We like to think we're past the Gilded Age, but the Elms whispers, very quietly, "Are you sure?" Because the dynamic it represents, the few building palaces out of the labor of the many, is not a historical glitch. It's a recurring pattern in different forms, in different times. We're living in one of those times right now. The difference is, our palaces might be digital rather than physical, server farms instead of chateaus, stock portfolios instead of marbled hallways, algorithms instead of servants. But the basic question, who gets the comfort and who provides it, hasn't gone away. In that sense, the Elms is less a museum of the way things used to be and more a mirror, tilted at a different angle. So the next time you see a photo of the Elms, this serene, pale stone house with its symmetrical windows and elegant terraces, remember that it was almost a parking lot. Remember that, for a while, the plan was to reduce it to dust. Remember that, for a long time, the story it was designed to tell was only the pretty half: success, refinement, taste. And remember that now, if we choose, we can let it tell the whole story. The story of a boy in a coal town and the elegant woman sipping tea on a terrace. The story of a cook sweating over a hot stove in the basement while guests complain about the weather in the drawing room. The story of a wealthy man building a monument to his own permanence and the decades rolling over his grave anyway. The story of a nation that tried to erase this evidence of its extremes, and then, at the last moment, decided that maybe the evidence mattered. If you ever find yourself walking up that drive, listen closely. You won't hear coal being shoveled anymore. You won't hear the rustle of servants moving through hidden corridors as bells ring on the walls. You won't hear the clink of crystal at a coal baron's dinner. But you might hear something else. The quiet, uneasy conversation between beauty and guilt, between what we admire and what we'd rather not admit, between the past we built and the past we almost buried. That conversation is the real voice of the Elms now, and once you've heard it, it's very hard to unhear.